What have we here, you ask? Well, it's clearly watermelon rinds. And today I've got a couple worm bins that need to be fed. So this is part of what they're going to be getting. And after 10 days, I would think that these bins are going to be pretty hungry. I remember once reminding myself not to wait much more than a week, max 10 days between feedings on these bins, because they are very, very heavily populated bins. So after 10 days, I'm curious to see how they're doing with regards to food. I would think they're probably running a bit low. And we're going to pop in there and give them some of this. Another thing I'm interested in taking care of is I've got a couple mango seeds inside of those bins. I know one of the bins has at least 2 and the other bin has at least 1. And I want to use this knife to try to puncture the outer husk of those seeds, because a mango seed within your worm bin can stay intact for months and months. But as long as you've opened it up somehow, cut it open or whatever, that should allow for it to more readily break down. So I'm going to be trying to take care of that today as long as I'm in those bins. But it shouldn't take too long, just a quick feeding of 2 bins, a little bit of maintenance on some of the food that they've already received, so it shouldn't take too long. So I'll put a glove on now and get those bins out here and we'll get to work. So here we have the younger of the 2 bins. I was actually in this bin just a couple days ago, and I was adding additional worms that had been rounded up out of a nearly completed batch of finished compost, where I'm attempting to bait the worms out of the material. But I really didn't do anything other than that. I just peeked in here, took the worms that I'd collected and dropped them in here, and I let them disperse, and then I covered things back up here and let things continue. But I believe at that time already it was pretty clear that the food that this bin had been given previously was pretty far gone, because there's a pretty good sized divot developing over here down the middle, sort of a cavity forming. I have to figure out some sort of a better solution for this so I don't end up making a huge mess everywhere every time I go to remove these plastic sheets. Alright, but let's just continue with taking care of the matter at hand. The bin has not been fed for 10 days. So over those 10 days there's been a lot of activity. You could tell there's castings everywhere, and they're piled pretty thick. Wow, look at the size of that cocoon. I'm pretty sure these red wiggler cocoons are able to produce more than 1 worm when they hatch. So that's a big one. I wonder how many are going to pop out of that one. It's still very light in color. That one's probably going to take some time before it goes anywhere. So the feeding was down here in the middle. Usually there's an indicator, such as this coffee filter, to show that that's where the feeding had been. But between the food being there and it being right on the top where all the moisture collecting on the plastic condenses and drops down onto, that paper just does not stand a chance. It's just going to get gobbled up 1, 2, 3 by the worms. Let's begin opening up a little spot where we could throw in the new food. One thing that's tricky in this bin is the fact that we are approaching capacity, so I've just got to be careful not to end up pushing stuff over the edge and out of the bin. These are the carrots that I gave them 10 days ago. Quite intact still, if I do say so. Carrots, you know, if you eat carrots, you must know that they have a kind of a sweet flavor to them, especially if you've eaten cooked carrots. They're deliciously sweet, or at least I think so. So basically they're high in sugar, and I think that that might be one of the reasons my worms typically really seem to enjoy carrots. Although I think on the World Composting channel, I think carrots were one of the foods used in the time lapse that was shown there not long ago. And they sure ate that up quick. So this is one of our jobs today, is going to be to get some holes punched into these mango seeds. I can't remember if this was the bin that had 2 of them, or maybe the other bin had 2. Oh, this might be it right here. Now my reason being that little baby worms really seem to enjoy the mango seed. And I think because you don't notice it when you pull it right out of the fruit, but as it starts to break down, the mango seed starts to show how it's made, and it's made of very, very densely packed fibers that are super, super thin. You know, probably thinner than a human hair. And as that stuff all starts to sort of come unbound from each other and separate and lift up, the whole surface of the mango seed starts to become kind of fuzzy and furry as that material starts to lift up. And I believe that that's really what the little tiny worms seem to like. And talk about tiny worms, they are everywhere, and they're so small. I mean, this little guy on the tip of my finger, how old can that worm be? You know? Feisty. Wants to get off my finger. No problem, buddy. So that's just the one thing I'm noticing here as I'm picking through. Or maybe it had something to do with the fact that we're handling the mango seed, and that's kind of a magnet for baby worms. I mean, talk about baby worms. They're just all over the place. I just look around and I just see worm cocoons all over the place. So that means even though this bin is already super heavily populated, which, you know, a lot of worm farmers would expect that the worms just sense that they're kind of heavily, densely populated and that they probably shouldn't be reproducing and making more, but it seems like in a bin where there's always a plentiful supply of food, it doesn't seem to matter so much if they're really getting densely packed. They just keep on reproducing. So I see cocoons all over the place. A little bit damp down here as I get underneath where the feedings have been getting put in. I'm trying to gauge how much bedding material remains in here. The bedding that I was going to use today was just going to be a few coffee filters, used coffee filters. So I was going to throw the food into those as I place the food into here as we feed. And that would kind of provide them with a little bit of bedding along with the food. Here too, this is a slightly smaller size mango seed, one that actually was hacked in half before it was placed in here. Right away you can see the worms burrowing down into it, a number of worms, all gobbling up the seed that's in there. I would think that the seed within this husk is what they really like. It's got, you know, all the nutrients. The outer husk though also seems to be pretty popular, so the entire mango seed is really something that the worms seem to dig. It's just so dense that it takes quite a long time for it to finally get broken down. Not even sure what this is. You know what it is? This is like the very last little remnants of a piece of Brussels sprout. There's hardly anything left. There was a whole batch of Brussels sprouts that had sort of a weird mold or black stains on it and stuff. It just didn't look like it was going to be good. So rather than eat it, it became worm food. So you would hope that by now something the size of a Brussels sprout would have been broken down. So that was promising to see. Here again, another small mango seed that had been hacked in half with worms cruising right down into the center of it to get at the insides. Like I said, things are a little bit damp in here, but by adding watermelon, we're only going to be adding more moisture. But the worms are not going to care, that's for sure, because they love this. So let's get feeding. Now before we get to giving them some of the fresh food that we've got for them, I don't want to forget about trying to help these two old mango seeds break down. So my only real objective here was to infiltrate the husk in a couple spots, taking care not to injure any worms in the process, because it's not been infiltrated yet, and I think the worms gaining access to the inside of it is pretty key. And I've not yet seen how this method works. I've already tried it in a couple other spots, but I've not yet seen how well it works. It's kind of an experiment, but it's got to be better than doing nothing. So I think this might help. So we'll see. Let's do the other one too. There's a lot more little baby worms on this one. Gotta be careful. Okay, so we'll see what happens now with those mango seeds. These carrots, pretty soft now, through and through, like it was stewed or something, so I'm sure that just means it's been infiltrated by the microbial life in the bin. Oops, did I poke this little guy? There's already a worm hanging out here. Maybe it just came off my glove, I'm not sure. It's a pretty good sized worm. Look at the size of that. These are red wigglers, but for a red wiggler, that's a pretty good sized worm. All right, let's get all this old stuff right back down into action here. This is where all the fun's going to be, in this bin down here by these carrots, and with these seeds that have been opened up to give the worms access. So that should be a pretty popular spot in the bin. Here too, pumpkin stem, more mango seeds, blah blah blah. We'll try to get all these partially eaten in progress food items back down where we pulled them out of. So like I said, we're using coffee filters as little burrito wrappers, if you will. So I'm just going to take, a couple pieces of watermelon. Oops. Throw a little bit of coffee and grit in there too. I would think that this is going to amount to a virtually irresistible little package of food here. I don't want to go too overboard, so I was thinking maybe 2 of these. It's nice to be using a semi-clean piece of paper for this because you can use it as a napkin. I think it's been a while since my worms were fed watermelon, but from what I remember, it's one of the top favorite foods that they just go nuts over. So I believe that's really all I had planned on doing here today. I do want to respect the fact that this bin is so close to capacity that going overboard on packing it up could really affect future maintenance. Because, every time you try to, for example, make room to add stuff and you go pushing things up against the sides, you really come close to just pushing it right out of the bin. So let's cover these little guys back up. And while we're doing so, let's also just take a glimpse on how things look on the outside here as well. Jeez Louise, look at all that. There's like a whole bunch of bedding that has probably been down there since the very beginning of the bin's build. I thought that in some of my bins, at least, I had already kind of gone down to the very bottom to try to get all this stuff up off the bottom. But maybe I didn't do that in this bin. So why don't we just really quickly, before we close this spot where all the action's going to be, I'm thinking if we can just find a little bit more of this bedding type material that, is all over the bottom, we might be doing ourselves a big favor by putting it where all the food's going to be eaten, because then it'll give it a good chance of being consumed as well. And just the fact that we're getting it up off the bottom is a huge plus. I did not realize that that was the case here. I'd already observed this in other bins, but over here it's really going to help a lot, I think. I'm glad we noticed that. All these big pieces of cardboard and paper we're pulling out. I think just the general agitation of the material throughout is probably going to help a lot, because at the top, upper levels, we're just, pure castings, and if you don't dig down deep, you get this sense that you've got a almost completely finished bin full of vermicompost here. But once you start noticing that there's all kinds of uncomposted leaves and cardboard and paper and everything else down below, you realize that there's still a ways to go. And I think the most important thing is just getting it up off the bottom of the bin so it's not laying up against the plastic. I think just by having it suspended out within the material, it will enable the worms to be able to approach it from all angles. Interesting. Okay, well, I'm glad we kind of discovered that. So I'm going to assume we've got a similar situation occurring on this side. So we're going to till up the bottom here too, if that's what we find. I'm pretty sure it's what we're going to find. But all the stuff you peel off the top, it's like almost perfect castings. The only thing that I would say prevents it from being perfect is the fact that there's still a fair number of these little tiny sticks and stems off of the leaves. But they certainly don't compare to what they look like when they're still fresh. They're just tiny little thin fragments, almost broken down, but not completely. But once they do, what you're left with is really incredible worm castings here. Alright, I wonder if I might have actually tilled up one half of the container at one point and just not done the rest. No, I'm noticing the same here too. Looks like we've got a bunch of uncomposted material hanging out down here. And just a tremendous number of worms everywhere. This is probably one of my more heavily populated bins. The bin that we're going to feed next is the one that probably has the greatest number of worms in it. But I could be wrong, because this is quite a densely populated bin, which has just been my theme, I guess, this season, or at least for the past few months. Right down to even the new time lapse that I just released yesterday. That too I kind of classified as a bin that was populated very densely, so that we get to see what kind of results you can get when you're composting with a large number of worms. And I think this is a good example of that. You get really beautiful castings, and you get them quick. You got so many little workers here digging away at it, chowing down on it. Wow, it's incredible how many worms there are in this material. And they don't show any signs of slowing down. Alright, so here again I find myself doing something that could have been completed in about a minute and a half or 2 minutes, and here I am probably a half hour into monkeying with this bin. I only notice it because the camera's running and I could see how long it's been filming. And it's kind of a reality check that I should really snap out of it and move on and try to get this job finished. Alright, that was fun, but let's move on. Whoa, sorry about that. This thing's got some serious weight to it. And that's the one amazing thing that you don't really realize about it. And when you sense how light the tub is in the very beginning when you first start, compared to how heavy a fairly mature, nearly done bin is. Oops. I always feel bad barging in on a couple worms mating, but here's an example of 2 worms actually connected to one another, mating, basically. So, sorry, did not mean to do that, but in the long run you'll thank me because you're getting some delicious watermelon. Here too, we're probably facing the same situation with regards to what's at the bottom. So before we get into any surprise situations, let's just do a quick proactive little probe down into the bottom just to see if that's the case here. I may have already noticed this in this bin and taken care of it. So I'm not really seeing any signs of excess bedding towards the bottom, perhaps excess worms. Very, very busy box with very, very limited space to do things here. You can see I'm trying to be so careful, because if I'm not, I could end up with a whole bunch of this stuff just flying off the table, making a mess. I'm happy to say that even really down low, the material is very, very consistent. Not like what we just saw in that somewhat younger bin. And that might have something to do with it too, the fact that this bin is perhaps a month older, if I'm not mistaken, than the one we just fed. So it's not surprising, I suppose, to see somewhat more advanced progress. Down here, as we're getting more towards the middle, I could feel things down in the feeding zone as I probe in. Like maybe some remainder of the food they were given last time. Maybe there's some leftover carrots in here too. Just out of curiosity though, since I can't seem to resist, just wanting to check the lower reaches of the bin over on this side too. Same results, same sort of pretty consistent, nice, heavily broken down stuff. But over here on the edge I found a big stick and a peach pit. Peach pit would usually get put right back in with the rest of the food to keep it where all the action's occurring, but I must have lost track of it there. Here too, a fairly good sized stick with a fairly good sized worm hanging out next to it. Oh, there we go. A little bit ended up on the table, luckily not too much. I've got to be careful. What is this? Oh, I thought this was maybe a Brussels sprout, but you know what it is? It's a really tightly jumbled ball of paper. Wonder how that might have happened. Usually I try to take care to make sure stuff like this is pretty loose with as much surface area as possible, so to have like a little bundle of it down there is not what we want. Everything we've seen so far has been in the bin for a very long time. But the stuff that we gave them most recently, banana peels, carrots, things like that, should have probably been eaten pretty quickly. Cantaloupe, I believe, was on the menu last time. So even though we might expect to see some carrots that are not completely eaten yet, I would think stuff like the cantaloupe that they were given last time would probably have been depleted by this time. Very, very busy bin. Some pretty good progress occurring on these pieces of carrot. But once the worms remove themselves from those carrots, we can even help it a bit more just by opening them up a little bit, cracking them open so that more of the surface area is available. Here's another sort of experimental item. I believe it's an avocado pit, which if you've ever held one in your hand, you'll know that it's usually rock hard. And all I'm doing now is just trying to see if there's any chance that it's making any progress. There are a huge number of little tiny hair-thin worms on here. Quite possibly just hatched worms. I always wonder why they're drawn to the seeds. Probably because there's a huge amount of nourishment there. There's a Brussels sprouts going back 2 feedings. A little tiny piece of one. This just looks to me like a ball of nothing but worms. This is crazy. Look at the amount of worms in here. I mean, if I pick through, I know I'm going to find a little bit of whatever. Here's a half of a similar seed. There's a bunch of bedding. True. But other than that, I mean, I've got like gazillion worms in here. It's awesome. I'm going to just evict a few of them, pull them out of the feeding zone just to give ourselves a little bit of space to work. Because we know that within a few moments they're going to dive down out of the light, take cover. Aha, found it. This was really what I was trying to find, which is the mango seed, which I'm going to just try to puncture. And anytime I find a mango seed from now on, I'm going to do the same thing. Because in the past I put them in whole like that, and it just takes forever for them to break down. And the one thing I did notice this past week was that while I was feeding one of my systems, one of the things I had placed into that was a mango seed that I had cut up into many pieces. And I found the large center section that had two ends of it chopped off, and for having only been in the bin for a number of weeks, maybe a few weeks, 3-4 weeks tops, the mango seed was remarkably far along in terms of being broken down. And it had to do with the fact that the center of it had been immediately made available to the worms versus leaving it as a whole seed that the worms are unable to infiltrate whatsoever. Okay, let's get this feeding done too. It's so distracting having bins that are this busy. You could just play in here all day because you've got so many worms and so much to see. It's incredible. Okay. I know the order seems to be a little bit different here, right? Last time we waited to put the new stuff right in on top. I think here we're probably going to begin with it. Not that it really makes much of a difference, I don't think. We'll just put these bits at the very bottom for them. Turn it around to give the paper more chance to get eaten. I think here maybe we've got enough food to make a third one, so we'll do 3 here. And I think that this is a slightly more heavily populated bin than most, so the extra food will probably be a welcome thing. Okay. Lots and lots of moisture coming along with this watermelon. It was frozen, and as it melts, you can totally see it producing a puddle in the bag that it's in right now. Ooh. Well, that's actually a little bit more of a generous feeding than I thought I'd be giving them today. But if any bin can handle it, I'm sure this one can. Let's, not forget. Let's give these bits that they're already working on now for the past 10 days. Let's see if we can help them out a little bit and crack them a little further wide open if we can. Expose more of the material. Help speed along the consumption process. And back in goes some of our experimental objects. Oh, did we forget one? Wow, this one's just coming along pretty good on its own because the knife just punctures right through it, 1, 2, 3, almost effortlessly. Over where the middle section is, it went right through. Okay, I was mistaken. I thought there was only one in here. All right, well, I think we are almost done. So very carefully, so as to not make a huge mess, I'm gonna start loading everything right back into where it came from. Sticks, seeds, everything else. And try to end up with a somewhat level surface here. I don't know how much longer we're going to be able to go with a bin like this. There is a certain point at which I would probably want to just make the call that it's time to stop feeding the bin, and let the worms really focus on what remains in the bin, because while it's very, very rich in castings, as you can see, there's also tons and tons of remaining food scraps and bedding scraps and you name it in here that they can certainly focus their energy on. If you keep giving them delicious, sweet, easy to eat stuff like watermelon all day long, they'll never focus on breaking down the little chunks of wood and stuff. They'll obviously go for the really easy to eat, sweet, delicious stuff. But if we let them starve a little bit, but by starve I just mean not give them fresh food supplies, they'll just turn their attention to the rest of the stuff in here that still needs to be eaten and broken down. So that could be in the cards for this bin very, very soon. Who knows? This might be the last feeding for a while, but we'll decide later. I'm not going to bother with that right now. Right now I just want to get things covered back up. Let these little guys have their peace again so they can get back to work. Very nice. It's so much fun working on busy bins like this, don't you think? I think so. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to give me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And also consider subscribing. That's really appreciated too. Thanks everyone. Have a great day. Bye now.